Hi, welcome to another video by Country Data Files. In our previous video, we analyzed the history of Metroid and Castlevania. Metroid and Castlevania are two retro video game series that started in 1986. They are memorable and have each become popular video game series. They've inspired a subgenre of action-adventure games called Metroidvanias. But which series is better, Metroid or Castlevania? That's a question I've made this video to answer. I'm going to compare them based on 2D gameplay, 3D gameplay, bosses, enemies, exploration, story, themes, characters, and relevance in popular culture. First of all, let's look at the 2D gameplay. Metroid 2D games have always been platform adventure, while Castlevania's 2D games didn't start out this way. Metroid was a pioneer of the Metroidvania genre, while Castlevania didn't have much non-linearity until Symphony of the Night was released in 1997. However, we did see some action RPG and exploration in Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, but it didn't have a map or leveling system. The Castlevania games of this style on the PlayStation, DS, and GBA have action RPG elements which Metroid has never done. For instance, players can fight monsters to level up. This is called grinding. Metroid doesn't have any grinding, and building up your health depends solely on exploration and finding upgrades. Speaking of exploration and finding upgrades, Metroid has iconic power-ups the player would find as they play, such as the ability to morph into a ball, allowing you to enter tight spaces, use wave and ice beams to freeze enemies, or increase your range of fire, or fly by constantly somersaulting. Meanwhile, Castlevania's power-ups were more simple, such as throwing knives, axes, crosses, or enhancing the character's whip. The platform games, when the series started, did this, and the latter games stuck with it. To progress, many different items exist. Some items needed to progress are extremely simple, like the power to get past magical seals. However, other objects were needed to progress, such as relics that allow the user to shapeshift into a bat, wolf, or mist, like in Symphony of the Night. Some others allowed the user to dash, double jump, or kick off walls. Area of Sorrow and Harmony of Dissonance continued this. However, Area of Sorrow and its sequel got rid of sub-weapons entirely and introduced the Soul system, used by Soma Cruz. Another DS game, Order of Ecclesia, did something different. Order of Ecclesia replaced weapons and relics with glyphs. Symphony of the Night and games about Soma Cruz had the player collect weapons as they played. I really like to travel around the game searching for weapons and armor to use. Castlevania has items similar to most RPG video games, and there are a lot of different spells the player can master. There are a lot of extra moves to look into, and a lot of stats you need to think about. However, Symphony of the Night is rather easy. The playable character, Alucard, can be overpowered pretty easily. The difficulty isn't balanced very well, which makes some of the boss battles pretty easy. Despite this, some of the puzzles are interesting and hard to figure out, like most RPGs. Fortunately, some future Castlevania games did a better job with the difficulty. Moving on, Castlevania games have very familiar level design, as most Castlevania games take place in Dracula's castle. This makes every game similar to each other, so it gets a little repetitive. Metroid games are on different planets. The first Metroid, Super Metroid, and its remake are set on planet Zebiz, while Metroid 2 and its remake are set on SR-388. Metroid Fusion is set in a space station called Biologic Space Laboratories, and Metroid Dread is set on a new planet called ZDR. Metroid locations are slightly similar, as most games have lava, ice, and water zones. Both Castlevania and Metroid have some interesting areas because they're both platform adventure games where players have to explore new areas. Super Metroid has a wrecked ship that has been abandoned, so the player has to search it to find the gravity suit and defeat a boss named Phantoon. Castlevania has some original sections, but many sections of the castle are similar to the ones in previous games. For instance, underground caverns, clock towers, and chapels are in almost all Castlevania games. However, Dawn of Sorrow is a little different because it starts out with the player exploring a lost village. Since this is a different castle, it has some different rooms such as a demon guest house, but it's still not that different. Metroid and Castlevania have extremely different combat in their 2D games. Metroid has Samus use an arm cannon with missile and beam upgrades. In Super Metroid and most games, Samus can charge her arm cannon for more powerful shots. Castlevania has a large variety of weapons. Most games featured a Belmont that wields an iconic whip. However, the series played around with swords, spears, and other things. In Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow, Soma Cruz can use a handgun. For the 2D gameplay, we're going to have to give a point to Castlevania. Castlevania had a head start to make its first 3D game, while Metroid didn't get any 3D games until the 6th generation of video game consoles. However, Castlevania's 3D games are not very impressive. The Metroid Prime series is a first-person action-adventure full of puzzles, exploration, and plot. The Metroid Prime series had 2 sequels and a spin-off, while another 3D Metroid game called Other M, which was mostly in third person, also exists. However, Castlevania's 3D games don't follow the Metroidvania style. The Nintendo 64 games were more linear platform games with shaky controls, and the Lords of Shadow series were more like hack-and-slash action-adventure games. They weren't Metroidvanias. However, the PlayStation 2 and Xbox games Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness had some Metroidvania aspects, but the level design was repetitive. The 3D games of both of these series were very different. The Metroid Prime games were more about exploration, while the Castlevania 3D games were more about mediocre action. In fact, these 2 series have very little in common in the 3D games except for being action-adventure games with some platforming. We're going to have to give a point to Metroid for the 3D games. Boss battles are another aspect of both Metroid and Castlevania games. Metroid is known for Ridley, Kraid, and Mother Brain, while Castlevania is known for Count Dracula, Death, and Carmelia. Many of the Castlevania bosses are around the same size as the player, while some are much larger. These bosses mostly depend on hit points, as each boss has a certain amount of hits they can take before dying. These bosses require the player to strategize against them and pay attention to the stats of both characters and bosses. This is what bosses in RPG video games are like. Most RPG games don't have health bars, but have a specific amount of hit points, which Castlevania's action RPG games did this, while the originals had health bars. These bosses are designed to overwhelm the player with high hit points, which Castlevania bosses do. Castlevania bosses usually come from folklore, literature, mythology, and religion. Castlevania's bosses are usually designed to be scary. However, none of them are that freaky. Most of them just look dumb and gross. Metroid bosses usually depend on using multiple different tools and weapons to figure out how to beat them. You have to figure out how they attack and use your surroundings to your advantage. This is similar to Nintendo's other action-adventure series, The Legend of Zelda. Metroid bosses usually stand in the player's way of getting to new areas and gaining new power-ups after beating them. For both of these series, the 3D games have boss battles similar to the 2D games. The Metroid Prime series bosses are fought in first person, but they're similar in size and methods to defeat as the bosses in the 2D games. Castlevania's bosses weren't that different in 3D either. However, sometimes consistency is golden. Curse of Darkness on the PlayStation 2 brought back health bars but stayed action RPG. Since Castlevania's bosses are a little bit more memorable and require more strategy, we're going to give a point to Castlevania for bosses. Enemies are also important. Metroid has had various different enemies since the beginning. The enemies in the Metroid series are aliens. For instance, there are crab-like creatures called Zoomers that reappear in almost all games. There are bat-like Scree that are also a hassle to deal with. Most Metroid enemies are insectoid. In the later games, you encounter insectoid space pirates, and there are some other reoccurring enemies such as sidehoppers and wavers. Metroid Prime had several of the previous enemies returning in 3D along with some new ones. In Metroid Fusion, many of the reoccurring enemies are infected with X-parasites, which makes them revive stronger after being defeated. Consequently, enemies from the previous game show up in new forms. Metroid Dread introduced a few new creatures to fight on planet ZDR, but the big threat was ME robots. Halfway through the game, the planet is overrun by X-parasites, which make creatures harder to beat. So, Metroid enemies are made specifically for the series. Castlevania enemies are the opposite. Castlevania enemies come from mythology, folklore, and monster movies. They appear in Dracula's castle and attack the player. The player mostly encounters zombies, bats, skeletons, mermen, and demons. Occasionally, witches and werebeasts are also a threat. One enemy that's always a problem are flying Medusa heads, which take some use to getting around. Even when the series changed to the Metroidvania style, the monsters stayed consistent. Some of them are inaccurate to folklore or mythology. For instance, Medusa's species, Gorgons, are nearly identical to Catoblipus, buffalo monsters. This inaccuracy is shared with Dungeons & Dragons, which made Gorgons bull monsters instead of humanoids, and says that Gorgons and Medusa are separate species. In my opinion, this is chaotic stupid. What makes matters worse is that only flying golden Medusa heads turn the player to stone. Honestly, I think this is stupid. Why they even decided to make Gorgon heads flying, I don't know. But the Castlevania gameplay added a couple of good additions involving these enemies. The monsters of Castlevania fill an inventory that you can use to keep track of them and see the names of the monsters you defeated. Also, they all drop different items when destroyed, so this should motivate you to continue looking through the game to find all the items. Since Metroid bosses are more original, not offensive or derivative, we're going to have to give a point to Metroid for this. In both of these video game series, exploration is very important. Metroid started this in 1986 with the exploration of an open-ended world. Super Metroid introduced the iconic, frequently updated map and mini-map during gameplay, which this became common in the games of the Metroidvania genre. Metroid Fusion, Dread, and the other 2D remakes kept the map system, and each game has a different location. In fact, even in the 3D games, there's a mini-map which is very similar to it despite the game shifting from third person to first person. Castlevania, on the other hand, lacked a mini-map in the first few 3D games. Also, Castlevania games focusing on exploration were very similar to each other. All of them except Order of Ecclesia and Dawn of Sorrow were set in Dracula's castle, which is very similar in the many different games. Also, when Castlevania became Metroidvania, it lost the extreme difficulty of the older games. Metroid has puzzles to see if the player understands the game mechanics by using the speed boost power-up. We're going to have to give Metroid a point for exploration. Our next round is for the story. Metroid and Castlevania's stories are very different. Metroid is a science fiction series about a bounty hunter, while Castlevania is gothic horror about vampire hunters. Metroid was inspired by the Alien film series, while Castlevania is an extension of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Despite Castlevania being technically a horror franchise, Metroid is actually scarier than it. Metroid has a sense of dread and isolation that Castlevania lacks. Nintendo usually cares more about gameplay than storyline. For instance, Super Mario has no timeline, and the Legend of Zelda timeline is confusing to say the least. However, the Metroid timeline is simple and unsurprising. The first game is at the start of the timeline, and the last game, Metroid Dread, is at the end of the timeline, while the Metroid Prime trilogy is set in between the first and second game. The lore of the series depends on the Chozo. The Chozo were a species of bird-like aliens that were a powerful interstellar race that encountered the X-Parasite. The Chozo created the Metroid creatures to stop them, which only made things worse. The Metroids became a threat to the entire galaxy, so Samus has to stop space pirates from weaponizing them. One baby Metroid sacrifices itself to give Samus a hyper beam attack that she uses to defeat the space pirates' leader, Mother Brain. With the Metroids gone, the X-Parasites make a comeback, and after barely surviving an encounter with the X, Samus has to destroy a space station infested with them. She smashes it into planet SR-388 to destroy both the planet and the station, annihilating the Metroids and the X-Parasites. However, some of the X-Parasites were on another planet called ZDR. In Metroid Dread, the final game in the timeline, Samus investigates planet ZDR to find a Chozo warlord named Ravenbeak and destroys the planet, presumably annihilating the X-Parasites for good. This is the story of the Metroid series. The Castlevania timeline is slightly less simple, and many games are non-canon. Super Castlevania 4 on the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64 games, Circle of the Moon, Castlevania Legends, and the Lords of Shadow series are non-canon. But in the main timeline, it starts with Lament of Innocence and ends with Dawn of Sorrow. Unlike Metroid, the games are set several decades or hundreds of years apart, in a timeline that spreads across many generations. The timeline starts in 1094 with Leon Belmont, a knight who served the church in the 11th century. He witnesses the rise of Count Dracula and creates a powerful vampire killer whip through the tragic death of his fiancée. He then passes the whip down through his family line, although they're exiled and hide for many generations. Over the next few hundred years, Count Dracula grows more powerful as he becomes the Dark Lord. For centuries, Leon's family, the Belmont clan, fights Dracula as he frequently comes back around once every 100 years. Eventually, the Belmont clan mysteriously fades away into history after Richter Belmont is used as a pawn in a resurrection. Richter passes the vampire killer whip down to another clan called the Morris clan. Later on in 1999, there's a solar eclipse that would have allowed Dracula to return, but Julius Belmont, the last descendant of the Belmonts, seals the castle within the darkness of the eclipse, destroying Dracula for good. There is a prophecy saying that Dracula's new heir would return in 2035 to claim the castle on the night of a solar eclipse. Dracula's reincarnation, a man named Soma Cruz, decides to be the good guy and comes to the castle to destroy the supreme entity of chaos, ending the evil of Dracula once and for all. In 1036, a cult tries to find a new Dark Lord, but is foiled by Soma Cruz. This is the end of the Castlevania timeline. Recently, the story has become a popular anime series for adults. Although it's more confusing than the Metroid timeline, Castlevania's storyline is set across many generations. So we're going to have to give a point to Castlevania for its story. Connected to the story, let's look at the themes. Metroid is about the consequences of tampering with nature. It's about aliens and humans thinking they can play God by genetically engineering and weaponizing alien creatures. The storyline has Samus discovering the scary truths behind the Federation and the Chozo. For instance, in Other M, the main villain, MB, is an android created to control Metroids. She hid and ran from Samus and the Federation officers while the space station was abandoned, and witnessed some of the Federation's troops kill each other. In the end, Samus has a monologue saying that it wasn't MB that was insane, it was the scientists who created her. The rest of the series is about Samus standing up against the governments that fight over the Metroids. Later on in the timeline, Samus realizes that the Federation will weaponize the X-Parasites and it will be just as much of a problem as the Metroids. So, she destroys a research station infected with the X and the planet they're from, so this won't happen. Castlevania, on the other hand, is about the corruption of the Church. Historically, the Church was criticized for corruption during the Middle Ages, which is when some of the Castlevania games are set. It focuses on Dracula attempting to wipe out humanity for revenge because the Church burned his second wife at stake. Castlevania is extremely satanic and anti-religious. In fact, in Japan, the series is called Akumajo Dracula, which literally translates to Devil's Castle Dracula. So when it comes to themes, we're going to have to give a point to Metroid on this one. Another important aspect of a video game series is the characters. Metroid is known for Samus Aran, who was one of the first female video game characters, and Castlevania is known for Simon Belmont, the main character of the first game, and Alucard from Symphony of the Night. Also, this franchise's version of Count Dracula is praised. However, many of the Castlevania characters look and are very similar to each other. For instance, Justy and Leon Belmont are like that. But it has some other characters that have been praised, such as Soma Cruz and Shinoa. Metroid doesn't have too many characters. Samus is depicted as silent and doesn't have much character development. And there are only a few other human characters, including Commander Adam Malkovich, who dies at the end of Metroid Other N and becomes an artificial intelligence program that assists Samus in 2 games. But there are some alien villains throughout the series, such as Ridley and Ravenbeak. Honestly, we're going to have to give a point to Castlevania for characters. The last point will be given to relevance in popular culture. Both Metroid and Castlevania have inspired a subgenre of action-adventure games called Metroidvania. Some new game developers grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, which is when 2D Metroid and Castlevania games came out. So, 2D platform adventure games inspired by them are extremely common nowadays. Many of the modern Metroidvania games have gameplay similar to the Castlevania games on the GBA and PlayStation, while some have RPG elements and equipment-based progression like Symphony of the Night. While some are more like Metroid with its science fiction elements and shooting rather than Castlevania's hack and slash style. Metroid is still going on, and its most recent game, released in 2021, was very popular. Some Metroid characters frequently appear in Super Smash Bros., and Samus is still an iconic character, as she was the first significant female video game character. Castlevania, on the other hand, hasn't had any new games since 2014, but there is a popular anime series targeted towards adults. Metroid definitely gets a point for modern relevance. By 5 to 4 points, Metroid wins. Honestly, it comes down to what you're into. If you're into gothic horror, hack and slash, and RPG games, Castlevania is better. But if you're a fan of Nintendo, like science fiction and shooter games, then Metroid is the game series for you. It also comes down to quantity and quality. Castlevania has more games, but the Metroid games are more consistent. What do you think? Which do you like better? I hope you enjoyed our video. Have a wonderful day.